Hello and welcome to this Lumen professional development video on early counting. My name's Catherine Gripton and I'm from the University of Nottingham. In this video, we're going to have a look at the development of early counting, the complexities of learning to count, how to support the development of early counting, and then one example of a practice to do this called counting collections. We know that early counting is really important because children's understanding of number during preschool is consistently associated with their mathematical achievement in primary and secondary. So this early counting experience, their early development of number sense, is supportive of their later mathematical success. It provides a foundation for later complex concepts and skills in mathematics, and predicts later functional numeracy knowledge. So it's an important thing that we're doing with young children when we're supporting their learning of counting. So let's have a look at the development of that to begin with. It begins very early. Very young babies show sensitivity to number. We know that 3-month-olds show changes in their brain when they're attending to number or numbers of items. We know that 6-month-olds, by looking at their eye tracking, can distinguish between larger and smaller groups of objects when there's a clear difference. So we know that the development of counting and their understanding of number begins really early, and we build upon that as children get older. This is supported by a range of factors, including their ability to spontaneously focus on numerosity. So some children do this a lot and other children do it not quite so much. It supports the development of counting because it's a tendency to focus on number. So the children who are doing more focusing on number, are more attentive to number, are having more experiences of it. They're starting to make connections between a number word and the number of items that they see. So they're focusing without any kind of guidance or support on numerosity is supporting their development of number and their ability to count. Children are also using their intuitive sense of number and relations. So they are using their approximate number system, and this develops over time and improves. It supports them to discriminate increasingly between groups of objects of different sizes. And how close they are to each other is something that they can do as they get older. And counting takes a long time to develop. It's complex. There's a lot more to it than learning the sequence of the number words or just numeral recognition. So it requires quite a lot of experience over time. Sometimes when children can first say the number words in order, somebody might say, oh, that child can count, but that's just the beginning. There's a huge amount involved in counting. I'm going to look at some of those in this session. It takes about 4 years to be able to learn to count to 20, from approximately 2 years to 6 years of age, but this varies enormously between individual children. So they are drawing together a broad range of skills and understanding in that time to really be able to count to 20. By the time they're around 8 years and they're starting to work with larger numbers and that's becoming more secure, this is becoming more intuitive. The relationships between all these different aspects of counting are becoming closer and more automatic for them. They are fully integrating then the understanding of number with the number word sequence that they've learned, but that takes a long time. There are lots of different developmental progressions for counting that show how counting typically develops for most children and the key kind of milestones or events along the way. What's clear is that things are quite consistent along a long period of time in terms of they are developing not one thing then the next thing then the next thing, but many things running alongside each other. There are lots of different developmental progressions available to you to support your understanding of the development of early counting. Here's a very simplified one. I would really recommend the one by Clements and Sarama on their Learning Trajectories website because that has an awful lot of detail in it and is thoroughly research based. In this simple one that we have here on the screen, I've colour coded some of the different elements so that you can see how those threads work through the different age groups. And the ages are very approximate. but the children are learning their understanding of numerals and the sequence and the order of the numerals. They are understanding the order of the number words. They are beginning to count physical objects, and they are beginning to count objects from a larger group as well. And they're beginning to subbatize, to recognize on sight small quantities, small groups of items, without needing to count each individual one. And that's really helpful as well. So there's a lot going on there within the progression in early counting. So let's have a look at some of the complexities there are within learning to count. Children have a range of different everyday encounters with number. They encounter numbers in lots of different contexts. So they may see a number, for example, on a football shirt, which tells you which player's shirt it is. It belongs to the player who has been given the number 3. They will hear about numbers being talked about in terms of things like buildings, so a 3-storey house, for example. They may live at flat number 3 and recognise the 3 numeral as being the one that's on their door. They may be 3 years of age and they may say, I'm 3. It may be very personally important to the child. And that means something different to the flat number, the football shirt number, and the 3-storey building. They may be told, or they may see on a clock, that it's 3 o'clock. There may be a number 3 in their phone number. They may want to get 3 objects, such as 3 biscuits, for example. Or they may see that somebody's come 3rd in a race. And these are all different uses of the same number 3. So for children, they are encountering this huge range of different ways in which 3 is being used. They need to understand that it can be used to describe 3 items, for example, 3 apples, so how many. They need to understand that it's a number within a sequence in between 2 and 4. So 3 is after 1 and 2, but before 4, 5 and 6. And they also need to know that sometimes it's just used as a label. So the number 3 bus, for example, doesn't mean that it's the 3rd bus that's coming along, or that there are 3 buses. It's just the number so that you know which one to get. So these different uses of number are helpful to children to understand what's happening, and they need to kind of navigate this as they're learning to count. And it's also important to think about what we mean by counting. So sometimes parents and families will say things like, oh, my Jamie, they can count. But what they often mean is that they can verbally count. They can say the number words in order, and they might be able to do this to quite a high number. Often when people say a child can count, they don't necessarily refer to object counting or item counting, counting ideas or sounds or objects, items in front of them that they can pick up. And there's a difference there. I count in verbal counting is being able to count like I run or I sing, something that I can do. When we're talking about object counting, it's an action on an object. So I count apples, I count ideas, I count rings of a bell. I'm counting something, and so it's an action on an object. So there's I count, and then there's I count apples. And we really need both of those types of counting when we're talking about early counting. In terms of the verbal counting to begin with, that's about learning the number words in a sequence, in an order. And there's a progression within that. So very young children start off by being able to make a string of number-like words. They aren't broken up yet, so it may sound more like one whole word, or perhaps like a song with a tune. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 isn't broken up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example. The next stage after that is moving to an unbreakable list. So it always begins with 1, but there are clear individual words for each of the numbers. It then moves on to becoming a chain, and it's a chain because it relates to what goes before and after. The next step is a breakable chain, where we have a clear sequence of individual numbers, and the child can start from any number within that sequence, recognising the connection to the numbers before and the numbers after. It then moves on to being a numerable chain, where children can count forwards and backwards, and they can keep track of how many they've counted on by or counted back by. It then eventually moves to a bidirectional chain, where all of this happens with ease and maybe automaticity. Children can count forward and back from any number, and they can switch direction. So learning the number words in order goes through a process, and that takes a lot of experience and quite a lot of time. In terms of them being able to use those number words to count objects, there's lots of complexities involved here. So on the screen, we've got a teddy, a hat, and an apple. And they can be known by other words to children. So an apple, they might also know, can be given the word fruit. It could be a piece of fruit. The teddy could also be a toy. The hat could also be clothing or something that you wear on your head. But either way, the teddy can't be an apple and can't be a fruit. The hat can't be an apple and a fruit either, which is different to how number words work. Because in numbers, when I'm counting, I can count the teddy as 1, the hat as 2, and the apple as 3. But I could equally have the apple as 1, the hat as 2, and the teddy as 3. So those items can have any of the number words, and that works differently to some of the other words that children have encountered in their everyday experiences. It also becomes even more trickier than that, because if I say the hat is number 1, even though the teddy and the apple could be number 1 before, they can't be number 1 now because the hat has been given the number 1. And as soon as I give the teddy number 2, the apple has to be number 3. Before I've said the teddy is 2, it could be 2 or 3. So the number words are being used differently to the everyday words, and that's something that children need to get used to. They also need to understand that they can have different items being counted together. So I don't need 3 of the same type of item. I don't need 3 apples or 3 hats or 3 teddies to be able to count 3 items. I can count things that are not the same at all, and still count them using those same number words. So in early counting, we have some counting principles. And what we've just been talking about there with the teddy, the hat and the apple are the kind of bottom 2 there on the slide, the 4th and 5th ones. And they are the kind of conditions that a child needs to accept to be able to count. They need to accept that any collection of like or unlike items can be counted as one set, that abstraction principle that we just mentioned. And they also need to understand that they can use the numbers in any order. They can count the objects in any order. They can use the numbers in the same order, sorry, but they have to count the objects in any order. And that they can change that, and no matter how many times they change that, they will still have the same result. And that's the order of relevance principle. The first 3 principles on that slide are more actions or things that the child needs to do whilst they're counting. So we're going to have a look at some of those now. The first one is that the number words are used in a correct and stable order. The second one is that they give 1 number word to each item being counted. And the third one is that they recognise that the last number they've just said represents the total counted so far and not just that individual item. And that's the cardinal principle. So we're going to have a look at some of those now. We're going to have a look at a video of 2-year-old Miles as he counts grapes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
How many grapes are there?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12.
Do you want to take the grapes and put them on the mat? Can you count as you do it? 1,
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
How many grapes are there, Miles?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So in the video there, we saw Miles counting his grapes. We saw that he had quite a stable order in the sequence of the number words as he said them, although when he got to 9 and 10, things got a little bit more muddled. In terms of his one-to-one counting, that was still developing. He was missing some items when he counted, and sometimes he was giving some items more than 1 number word. And that can be tricky, particularly when you're touching or pointing like he was, because he could point and say 2 number words at the same time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so the number of points weren't quite matching the number words. It also meant that he sometimes got a little bit muddled and missed some. It was interesting when he went to move the grapes at the end there, when his parent asked him to move one onto the mat, that kind of helped with him using one number for each item. And what was really interesting there was the question at the end of each time that he counted. So how many? And as soon as he heard the words how many, he immediately went into the counting behaviour. He hasn't quite yet grasped that when you've counted them, you can say how many, because you've counted them now, so you know how many you've got altogether, and that last number that you said in your counting sequence represents all the grapes that you've counted so far. It's quite common for children to hear the words how many and immediately go into counting. So that follow-up question, how many grapes do we have? How many are there? Is quite important to check that the children understand that they are counting for a purpose to find how many altogether. We're now going to have a look at another video. This time we have 3-year-old Hazel and she's counting some pennies.
Can you help me count these pennies?
Yeah.
How many are there?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 11, 12, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 11, 12, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 11, 12.
How many are there?
12.
So we watched Hazel counting pennies there. And you may have noticed that she had quite a stable order in terms of her counting, but the order wasn't quite correct yet. She definitely had a sense of the pattern of the number sequence, and you saw her come back round to the same little bit of the counting sequence time and time again in her counting. So while she's got a sense of the pattern, she's still developing how to use that. And you can see there why it's so tricky. Those teens numbers make it really difficult because they are not following the same pattern in terms of how we say them to how they are written. So she found it challenging to remember 13 and 15. And so she had quite a stable order, but it wasn't quite correct because she kept going back round to 11, 12, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 11, 12. She kept going round again. She wasn't quite sure what to do when she got to 19, what was going to be the next number for the next decade. And so that can be quite tricky. It can happen at 29 and 39 as well. 13 is particularly tricky because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 all have their own unique words. 11 and 12 also have their own unique words in the English language counting system. 13 is the first time where it changes, and so that's particularly difficult. I would also say that 13 and 15 are difficult because they don't quite follow the pattern of some of the other ones. So the other ones end with teen, and it's 16, 17. These are the numbers that they knew from 1 to 10, but with teen at the end. 13 isn't quite 3-teen, and 15 isn't quite 5-teen, and that can make them particularly tricky as well. So those teens numbers make it difficult, and children need to learn those numbers in the sequence. And they also need experience of counting higher numbers, because when they count larger numbers, those numbers then do start to follow some of the pattern, although not always. So the 21, 22, 23, 31, 32, 33, 41, 42, 43, as the numbers get bigger, that pattern becomes more clear within the counting system, and children get quite a nice rhythm to their counting and to go alongside it. So they need a lot of experience, particularly counting to 20, to help with those teens numbers that don't quite behave in the same way in the English language. She was clear about moving her coins from one place to another in order to count them. But unfortunately, she counted each time her finger touched a coin. So when she tidied the first 4 coins to the side, she then counted 5, 6 because she gave 2 more touches. So that one-to-one principle is emerging really well for her, but it needs a little bit more development to get it to be one number word for each item being counted. We also saw the cardinal principle. She was very strongly exclaiming that she had 12 at the end there. So she knew she was counting to find how many, and that would give her an answer for the total number of pennies she'd counted. Although she still hadn't got quite a sense of 12 because she hadn't realised that the amount that she had there were clearly more than 12. So her understanding is once again developing. So there's lots of things going on here with counting. There are lots of things for children to master, and that's why it takes a long time, and we need to support it really well. So if we look at how we support the development of early counting then, there are some key supportive practices that can be really helpful in any situation. In terms of emphasising that cardinal principle and how many we have when we've counted, it can be helpful for adults to model that to children. So when we're counting 3 cars, 1, 2, 3, there are 3 cars. By emphasising at the end how many we have in total, that can emphasise that cardinal principle. It's also helpful to sometimes be counting from a larger group rather than always counting all of the items that we have. So if you have a large group of pennies and you say, can you get me 9 from the group of pennies? We know that the child stops on 9. We know they've understood that the amount that they have counted so far is 9. So it really helps with the development of cardinality if we can count from a larger group. And 9 is particularly helpful because you immediately want to go to 10. So if a child can stop on 9, you know they've really understood that. We also need to be supportive by providing lots of representations of the number system. So number tracks outside on the floor that children can move along, washing lines with number cards on where the children can reorder them to get that ordinality of number. Maybe having 100 squares around, even if we're not expecting children to be able to count all the way to 100 or to recognise all of those numerals, we absolutely can have them in the environment from a young age to build that familiarity. So these are kind of some simple practices that we can do to support children's early counting. We haven't mentioned much about subitizing yet, and subitizing is really crucial with early number. It helps with counting as well. So there are 2 different types of subitizing. There's perceptual subitizing with a really small number of items. So where you can see on site straight away, immediately, without needing to count them, how many there are, then you've subitized. So hopefully immediately you've looked at that picture there and said there are 3 eggs there, without needing to count 1, 2, 3 eggs. And that builds a sense of the size of 3. If I can see it and recognise it straight away, perhaps maybe arranged in different ways. There's also conceptual subitizing, and conceptual subitizing is particularly helpful with numbers kind of larger than 4 or 5, because we can only see on site all at once, perceptual subitizing, up to about 4, perhaps 5 items at most. With conceptual subitizing, we start to recognise on site larger numbers of items because we can recognise smaller groups within them and immediately kind of put them together in our head. So if we look at the raspberries here, you might see the raspberries there as 4 and a 2, or you might see them as a 3 and a 3. You might not see all of them straight away, but it helps you to have a sense of how many there are there by subitizing the smaller amounts within that and knowing how they fit together. So it supports children's understanding of those numbers because they start to see numbers within numbers. So within the 6 raspberries there, we can see that there are 4 and 2. So that's a really helpful skill to gain a sense of those numbers and really understand the meaning of 6 when you know it's 6 items, but you also know that it's 4 and 2 and 3 and 3 and 5 and 1. So perceptual subitizing and conceptual subitizing are really helpful within counting, because sometimes we can subitize a small amount and count on from there, or we might subitize how many are there and we can find out how many without the need to count. And we can also check our understanding. So when we have counted some, we'll think, oh, that doesn't seem right, because it looks to me like there are about 5 there. And then count to check if we want to. But we don't always need to be checking. Sometimes we just recognise the right amount straight away, and that's a really important skill to develop. It supports later numerical and mathematical understanding. So subitizing is really helpful supportive practice for counting, and something that it's important for us to do with young children. It's also really helpful for young children if we draw their attention to the pattern within the number system. We have a wonderful number system that is highly patterned and gives us a clear pattern to follow. It's a growing pattern. So we can see on the left here that we've got just a simple number pattern 1, 2, 3, 4. But from this representation, we can see how each one is one more than the number before. By drawing together the order, the sequence of the numbers and how many they are, we draw together ordinality and cardinality in a way that's quite pleasing and comforting to see. It helps us with place value as well. So if we have a look on the right there, we have a representation of 1 to 20, and immediately you can see the 10 structure there within the teens numbers. And if you're learning to count those teens numbers, all of a sudden 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 are easier to understand when you can see the 10 and 1, 10 and 2, 10 and 3, 10 and 4 structure that's there in the number system. So drawing attention to pattern is really helpful in supporting counting as well. In terms of how we support early counting learning, the pattern, the subitizing that we've just mentioned are really important. It's also really important we encourage children to use their fingers. There are more than 27 different ways of finger counting, and different families may have different ways of finger counting that you want to find out about for those individual families, so we know how the child's been counting with their fingers at home. Fingers are really helpful and really useful for counting, and children will use them all the time to communicate how many they've got, to count how many they've got, to show something they know about a number so that they know they've got 6 or 6 in different ways. Sometimes children don't even need to look at their fingers, they can just feel them. So if you put their fingers behind their head or behind their back, or they put them down and they're not looking at them, they can still show you 5 straight away. So they've got a sense of how many 5 is. So we can use counting one at a time to work with fingers, but we can also do straight away ones where we show them instantly and we know that that's 5 or that's 4. We can use fingers alongside number rhymes and stories, and within everyday conversations and dialogue with children, and to talk about numbers. It's also really important that we have meaningful context for children. So that photograph in the middle there is a child who has got a cave and then some people figures when they're playing with these toys, and he's working out how many he's putting inside and how many he's got outside. So he's got 5 in total. At the moment he's got 3 outside and 2 inside, but he can keep switching it and he can make a story around the movement of the people inside and outside. So having a real context that's meaningful for the child is really important in developing their sense of all of these different numbers they're working with for when they're counting. It's also really important that they have experience. We talked earlier about spontaneously focusing on numerosity and how some children are more attentive to number than others in the world around them. For those children who are less attentive, it's particularly important that we draw their attention to number and we provide them with those experiences so that they are not permanently less experienced with number. So Sue Gifford talks about number novices and number experts, and I think it's helpful to think about that rather than high or low attaining or achieving, to think about the children being at an earlier, less experienced stage or a later, more experienced stage, and think about how we can provide lots of experience for all children with counting. And that's something we're going to talk about in a moment with an example from Counting Collections. And then the other thing that's on this side as well is enjoyment. It's really important to have fun with counting, to count things that you find enjoyable, things you like to count, enjoying counting footsteps, enjoying counting your favourite toys, maybe that you've lined up, enjoyment of counting in a wide variety of contexts with lots of different people. So enjoyment needs to be there as well, and that supports children's early counting too. We can provide routines for children that have lots of opportunities for counting within them, and provide these all the time, every day in their regular experiences. Within an early childhood setting, within early childhood education, we might do that for when they enter the setting. We might ask them to register by putting their picture or their name into a space, so that we can count how many children we have in the setting today. Sometimes we can do that for if children are staying for a meal time as well, to count how many children need to have that meal, or maybe how many children have brought their own meal with them. We can also have it in labelling around the setting as well, using dots or stars or other symbols to represent how many the numeral is representing. So in the example here, we have a pencil pot that should hold 10 pencils, and we have 10 stars to go alongside the 10, so that we know how many that means, and we can do that one-to-one correspondence as well. We can use voting in our everyday experiences. When you've got a group of children, ask them to vote for the story they would like for story time, or the toys they would like to have out next. And then we can compare how many would like each one and see which is more. So a real important context for accuracy. You really want to get that right so that you know that it's fair. And we can do counting when we're not counting objects. We can do counting up or down to a particular event happening. So when the family is coming to pick the children up, we're going to go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, then we open the door. So there are lots of ways that we can build counting into the everyday routines in early childhood education settings. Snack and meal times are a really good opportunity for counting, and one that's really important to the children. It's really important we get it right. So the children might be counting to make sure there are enough cups or enough spoons, enough milks, there are enough pieces of fruit, so that everybody can have one, which requires them to count the number of children and count the number of utensils or food items to make sure we've got enough. If there's not enough, they can then do some problem solving to then work out how to get enough. Maybe they might decide to divide the bananas in half and give everybody half each, or they might decide to go and get some more bananas so there are enough. They may have a problem where there are too many bananas. Are we going to put them in the cupboard for later, or we're going to chop them up and let everybody have a little bit more? So the children are making sense of something that's meaningful to them. It's a real reason for them to need to count. On the right hand side there, we've got a bit more of a challenging problem to do with snack time. So maybe if the children were choosing 5 grapes to put on their plate, they might decide how many red grapes and how many green grapes they would like to have. It's obviously important that we don't make children do the counting in order to get the food, because that wouldn't be right. But obviously what we're trying to do is we are trying to encourage the counting whilst the children are engaging in the meal or the snack time, adding the counting in and making the activity hopefully more enjoyable, and doing it in a way that's meaningful for the children. They might even start to predict that this is going to happen. They might start counting the number of children before we've even got the snack items out, if they're starting to recognise that we always need to make sure that we've got the right number for everybody. Counting books and counting songs are another really helpful context for supporting early counting. There are some lovely counting books that are intended to support counting that children can enjoy, and they can also have objects alongside them, or they could use their fingers alongside to go along with the counting. There are also other books that might not be intended for counting, where there are lots of counting opportunities in there, and you absolutely don't want to undermine the enjoyment of the story. It needs to be something that we enjoy as we go along. We don't want to be stopping and starting the story or just picking a little bit. We need to read the whole story together for it to make sense. But within that, there may be some opportunities at the end to go back and count, or as we're going along, to build up the excitement by counting, depending on the context in the story. So we'd be using the story to support the counting in a really meaningful way to the children without ruining the story. And there's lots of lovely counting songs and finger rhymes that we can do with children. So I've got 2 examples here, 3 wobbly jellyfish and 5 little ducks. We might also have 10 in the bed, or some of the other ones that you might know, or that the child might already sing at home in their families that you might want to find out about. But once again, having objects for those, using fingers for those, can really help support the development of counting in a way that's enjoyable and meaningful to the child. And there are lots of lovely games that we can play with children as well that involve counting. We can use cards to find when we've got the same or different amounts, when we'd have to count to make sure that we knew what we were doing there. You might have collecting games where you collect so many, or you give away so many when you're playing maybe with a dice or a spinner or similar. You might have target games where you're throwing to see how many are inside the bucket or the tyre and how many have landed outside, and counting to see. And there are some lovely track games, either indoor ones that you might play on a tabletop or a carpet or a low table, and outdoor ones with number tracks where children can jump along. And those track games are really helpful because they draw together the number of jumps, the cardinal aspect, with the order of the numbers, the ordinality as well. So they can be really helpful in supporting early counting too. So now we're going to move on to looking at a particular approach that you could take to add to and supplement all of those counting experiences that we've just been talking about in early childhood settings. This approach is counting collections and is something that's often used with older children, but sometimes used with younger children as well. And I'm drawing upon some research that Delia Pavlik and I did a few years ago on counting collections with 21 early childhood settings in England with 2 to 5 year old children in them. The purpose and our interest in this was really to provide additional counting experiences. We know that experience of counting is really important, and that some children are spontaneously focusing on numerosity more than others. So how can we provide lots of experiences of counting so that children aren't missing out on those, because some children will be doing it more than others in their play and in their everyday experiences at home and in a setting. So we try to develop a counting collections approach to provide all children with more experiences of counting. So what are counting collections? Well, it's similar to other counting activities really. The goal is to engage children in coordinating different aspects of counting in order to find how many there are within a group of objects. So for example, I have a counting collection here. It's just a box with some pebbles in, and I can find a way to count how many are in here to see how many there are. And that's as simple as it is really. You can have boxes and bags or jars, any kind of container and a set of items within it, and that's a counting collection that we can count. Within the settings that we worked with, each setting developed their own counting collections area. So within their counting collections resources, they had boxes, which were the collections of objects to be counted, but they also had some other things as well. They had some tools to go alongside these. So they had things like, this is a 5-frame box that could be counted into. They had little dishes and little pots to count into, and they also had some numerals and some number cards and some paper or whiteboard to write on as well, to go alongside the boxes that had the counting collections in. So here's 2 examples of the way that these areas, these counting collections areas, could be set up. You can see there the counting collections are on the lower shelves, just as it happens in these settings, and then they've got a range of different containers. So they've got jars and dishes and 10 frames, egg boxes, lots of different ones. They've also got some numerals or number cards and some writing tools as well. In the middle at the bottom there, there's a photograph from one of the settings where they decided that they wanted to have the counting collections grouped in some way, so that the ones that had a lot of items in were kept away from the ones that had a smaller number of items in. So for that setting, they had the collections that were kind of up to 10 with one colour label, the collections that were then kind of 10 to 20 with a different colour, and then the ones that were 20 to 30 with a different colour. So they had different size boundaries, different size groups within their counting collections. But you don't need to take that approach. You just need to make sure that all of the boxes or jars or bags or whatever you have different numbers of items in them. So the children need to find out how many. Here's an overview of some of the items you might like to include in counting collections. So there's lots of ideas for ones that could be indoors or outdoors. It's helpful to have some items that are very long that children might like to enjoy. If they enjoy counting things that are long, they might like to line them up, for example. It's also nice to have some more rounded items for the children who would like to pick them up and move them or put them inside pots. And you can use bought items, you can use items that you've collected from the outdoors, so collecting conkers and shells and leaves and twigs will also make collections. You can have mixed collections of different items in there. It can be quite helpful if the items have some variety in them, such as the pebbles that I just showed you there, so children realise that they can count things that aren't quite the same in the same group of objects. You can get children to donate ones that they've got at home, so if they've got some little items from party bags or something lying around, that they could be created into collections. So there are lots and lots of things. Anything that is small and will fit into a bag or a pot can be used for a counting collection. And over time you can change the size, so you can take some out and add some in to add some variety to it. You can even have an empty collection, the zero collection, because that's quite interesting for the children to talk about, particularly if they have that alongside their collection that they're counting and they want to say what the difference is between the two collections there. So there are lots of different things you can put in collections, outdoors and indoors, to make them quite interesting. And you can use large items outdoors. If you want to have buckets or large bags for your containers for your collections, you can do. There's also some ideas on here for tools as well. In the indoors, that would tend to be things like trays and dishes and boxes and containers and packaging and things like that. Bags can be quite helpful to count into as well. Also, you might like to have mats or containers with more than one space in them for counting into, so different areas to count into. Outdoors, they can be larger scale, so you might use something very large like a builder's tray, or even just as simple as a grass verge, where children can count into the two areas, the grassed area and maybe the paved area, if you've got it set out like that. So there are lots of different ideas there for how you might like to develop counting collections in a setting. And this is the general structure of a counting collections activity. So children generally work in pairs if possible. Children don't always want to work in pairs, and that's absolutely fine. And sometimes children might want to go and count something, choose a collection for themselves and do this independently. So we wouldn't restrict it to only being an activity in pairs, but a lot of the time it helps if they're working with somebody else. So together, those two children would choose one of the counting collections that they want to count today, having preference for the ones they particularly like often. Then they will plan how they will count their collection. So they've got to come up with some kind of a strategy here. How are they going to do this count? How are they going to perform this count? And then together they count the collection, and then they record the count together at the end. Often they'll record it using kind of pictures and drawings, and then they might record it using symbols or notation that you might recognise more as more formal notation. However, it doesn't need to go to that point if you don't want it to. It depends on the children and what's appropriate. What's interesting is when they choose the collection, they're already starting to express preferences. They feel they have ownership over the activity. When they're planning, once again, they have lots of ideas. They can think about different ways to count. They can strategize their counting, and once again, they're taking ownership. When they're counting their collection, they often count more than once. They will do it once, then do it again to check, or they will do it once and do it again another way. So there's extra counting going on in there because they're counting together and because they're being really careful to make sure that they're correct. And in their recording, they're counting again, because when they're drawing their symbols or they're drawing their pictures to go alongside, they're counting, and they're recording how they've counted and what they've counted, how many they've got. They're counting again. So there are multiple opportunities for counting within this one activity, rather than counting once, saying this is how many I've got and walking away. So the features, I would say, of a counting collections approach are that it's cooperative most of the time. The children are working together. It gives them a heightened awareness of the need to keep track of what they're doing. They're slowing it down because they want to make sure the other person is keeping up with them, and they're doing it together. It means sometimes that if one rolls away or moves away, one child can keep their finger on the last one counted before that child brings it back so that they can continue with their count. They tend to slow it down because they're counting aloud together. And so that cooperation really supports accuracy and those key counting skills we talked about earlier. It means that they can have preferences within their counting, just like they have particular stories they like to read time and time again, or have read them time and time again. They have favourite collections, things they like to count over and over, things they like to return to regularly, and they can have interests in counting, and they can have favourites and preferences. And it's a frequent, regular, hands-on counting activity. So this is really important for the children as they're developing those early skills, that they have lots of experiences of counting, and that is hands-on. They're doing it for themselves rather than watching somebody else count. And that's a feature of counting collections as well. So there are lots of features there that support early counting. And this is what children often do. So often when they are counting, one of their strategies, one of the ways they like to count, is to put items into a container. So we'll take them out of the box or bag or jar that the collection is housed in and move it into another container. And that movement helps them with that one-to-one principle, the tracking to make sure they give one number word to each item that they're counting. Sometimes they would arrange them. So we'll see, for example, here, one of the children here is lining up the plastic spiders that they were counting to help them with their counting. And that's their strategy to help with the count. On the right there, we've got a child who's moving those gems in the collection to count them, but also moving them in a particular formation. So you can see that they're being lined up in a particular way to bring order to help with the counting, with the accuracy. So children use arrangements, they use the movement of the objects, and they use containers to help them with their counting. Some children really like to put one object in each container, so having some very small containers can be very helpful with this. The children can put one in each one to check their counting, so they're counting them into the containers, checking that one-to-one principle. They are recounting to make sure how many they've got, so they're absolutely sure. And the child on the top there actually put the items upside down with a pot on top and then counted them by lifting, so 1, 2, 3, 4 to count to make sure how many they had. The child on the right there, probably less commonly, matched other items in the environment to the 4 pine cones that they had counted. So they'd counted their 4 pine cones and lined them up, but then they went to get 4 more items to match them one-to-one to show 4 again, and then they'd repeated that another time. So there's a focus there on that one-to-one principle by the children using the objects in their counting collection in a particular way. Some children also arrange into 2 or more groups. So you can see there the child who's counting spoons in their collections, and metal spoons, they've got a group of 5 and another group of 5, and that is helping them when they're counting. So they're noticing the composition of 10 into 2 groups of 5 and 5 to help them as they move along with their counting. On the pictures on the left there, we can see that that one of the tools in that setting was a picture with 2 different areas, and so the child put some into the sky area and some into the grass area on the picture, and that helped them to count as well. They might even instantly subitize the 2 and recognize them straight away. In the bottom picture with the marbles collection in the basket, the child there has decided, or the children there have decided, to do a 1 at a time sharing way of counting. So they're going 1 in that side, 1 in the other side, 1 in that side, 1 in the other side, and then they will eventually count the 2 groups of objects together. So there are different ways that children might use arrangements and some groupings to start to help them with their count. Some children like to choose 5 or 10 frames to count into, and you can see here how children use them in different ways. Some children are counting by filling up the first row of 5 and then the next row of 5. Some children are filling up in any order that they like to choose because they are less experienced with 10 frames, given the fact that they are younger. And I think having that ownership is really quite important. It also emphasises to them composition of 10 when they arrange them in different ways. So the children on the right there, they are counting small collections. They haven't quite got as many as 10 there, but they can instantly see from the one in each space in the container that they've got that has 10 holes in it, they can see how many more they would need to get to 10. They can see something about the composition of 6, for example, when they can see it as 2 and 2 and 2, or 3 and 3. So it emphasises something about the relationship of 6 with 10. On the left there, we can see there are some children who are counting more than 10. So in the collection with shells there in the middle, the child already has another 10 frame ready because they think from just having a look at their collection that they're going to have more than 10 to count. So they've got 2 10 frames ready. You can see how children are counting by filling up the 10 frames, and then they are recounting them after they've filled them to make sure they've got the right amount and they know how many they've got there. So counting into containers, maybe into structured containers, can be quite helpful as well. And that can lead them slowly eventually towards counting in unitized groups. So here, the children in these examples have chosen to count into groups. Rather than the sharing that we saw earlier, they are choosing the size of the unit for each group from the outset. So on the left there, the 2 children there have chosen to put their pom-poms that they are counting into trays with 2 in each tray, and then they can count them that way. On the bottom left there, we have children counting in 3s, putting 3 fish into each tray in order to count them. Then we have a child who is putting into groups of 10, but they're just using one 10 frame to do that. So they're putting the sticks onto the 10 frame, and when they've got 10, they're collecting them together and putting them into a pot. So I know I have 10 in my cup now, and then repeating to do the same out so that they can find them. There's a support structure there to find groups of 10 so that they can count the number they've got. And on the right there, we've got a child who's chosen straight away to go into 10s, put 10 into each dish, and then they've got 1 left over at the end, and then they have represented that on their whiteboard with a 10, a 10, a 10, a 10, and a 1 for 41. Quite advanced stuff. We're getting to quite challenging counting in that example. So children can begin to count in unitized groups when they'd like to. And children recorded these in different ways in our Counting Collections project. So some children, when they were recording, to make their symbolic recording, they drew around the items in their collection. So you can see some examples of that on the top left there, where the child is drawing around the pom-poms to find how many of them. When they move the pom-poms away, they've got a representation that shows how many were in their collection. Children used a range of other ways of recording, because obviously it's free recording, it's up to them. And you can see in the middle there, one child has put theirs in unitized groups of 2, but they've sometimes chosen 2 sticks to represent 2 and sometimes 2 circles, and they know it doesn't matter. They know that the important thing is that they show there's 2 in each group. So children have a range of ways that they choose to record how many they've got in their counting collection. In some settings that we worked with, there was also some structured recording where sheets were given to children to record how many in their count. And you can see an example here where the child had counted 25 and they've got 2 groups of 10 and then 5 more because they decided to use 10 frames to do that. Now, the structured recording tended to be for children who are more experienced with counting, and it does depend on the setting. So if the setting is more used to using that way of working, that would be more appropriate. However, we did notice in a lot of the photographs the children didn't look quite as enthused or having quite the same enjoyment where they were being asked to structure their recording in a particular way, and the unstructured recording seemed to lead to more interesting examples that help the adults to see what it is that the children are understanding within their counting and how they are understanding it. And some children like to label their collection, and that's where those having a numeral or number cards can be really helpful as well. So you can see here children are using their fingers to say how many they've got in their collection. There's a child there writing on top of the lid of the box with a whiteboard pen to say how many is in their collection, and a child on the right there getting the numerals, so going to go and get a number card, a 16 number card, to show that they've got 16 in their collection when they've counted. So being able to label your collection really emphasises how many we have in the collection, that key aspect of cardinality. And it's quite nice for children to create and share their counting collections with others. So children can make collections at home if you send a bag home or you send an empty jar home, then children can make their own collections of things that they find, which could be party bag toys, could be conkers that they've collected, could be leaves they've collected, it could be pieces of pasta they've collected, it could be little snippings of bits of paper. It doesn't really matter what the children want to choose. It's important that for them it's meaningful and they like to count that thing. And so then you get the nice thing when they bring them into the setting where the children say, I want to count Millie's collection today, or I want to count Jay's collection today. And so it's quite nice for the children to count each other's collections. And this can be quite interesting where some children choose to create some quite large collections. We had one example in our project where a child wanted a collection of 11 books and the teacher had to find them a really large bag to put all of these books in because that was their collection of 11 books. So they can be indoors and outdoors, they can be created with families, and children can make their own ones, which is quite nice. There can be themed collections, particularly around festivals, maybe you can have a birthday collection or something like that. And also you can have family sessions of counting collections. So whilst you're doing counting collections in an early childhood setting, families can join in, and rather than children working as a pair with another child, they can work in partnership with a family member, and that can be really nice as well. One of the benefits of using counting collections is that there's quite a few steps to the process, and that helps make the counting more visible to the adults working with the children. So through observation, we can see how the children are choosing to count. We can observe their counting because their counting has slowed down because they're doing it together and they're doing it really carefully. They're maybe moving things into containers. So we can see what's happening, which really helps the adults work it out. And through having the recording and being able to watch what the children are doing with the objects in the collection, we can see quite a lot. And this is quite helpful, for example, on this slide, where we can see that the children counted in threes, but when they had 2 left over at the end, they put them into one dish, which then led to an error when they were recording, because they then had to check very carefully because they got a collection of 2 in with their collections of 3 in their groups of 3, and that made things a little bit more challenging for them. So it gives you the opportunity to see that happening when you have the recording and you have the observation of them doing the counting as well. So there are multiple opportunities to gain insight into children's mathematical thinking. We can watch how they are moving the things they are counting. We can listen in to what they're saying to each other, and we can have a look at the recording as well. So there are multiple opportunities for assessment. So in terms of how these counting collections might support early counting, they provide regular, rich experiences, which are particularly important for children who are less experienced with number. It encourages them to work together, to engage in discussion with each other. It encourages them to explain or show their reasoning to other people. It encourages them to communicate their mathematical thinking by using objects through talk and also through gesture and through their recording. It slows down the counting process, making each step really explicit. Helps them to keep track of their counts as they go along. It helps them to check to make sure that they've counted correctly, and it helps them to refine their counting strategies so they can choose more efficient strategies as they go along. It helps with the grouping and ungrouping, so that supports unitizing, composition and place value, and it helps them to understand the magnitude, the sense of each number, to how many 20 are. It helps them to gain that sense from regular counting experiences of collections, seeing them as one collection in that way. And one of the key things that I think are really important about counting collections, it supports that agency and ownership. So rather than the children waiting for an adult to give them counting opportunities or finding them for themselves, there are lots of opportunities within the for them within what they want to count. They get to choose, they have preferences, they can choose the way they want to count, what they want to count. It allows us to as adults to see their competencies and their strengths. It is a can-do focus. It focuses on their competencies and things that they're good at, and helps them to negotiate their own mathematical experiences rather than them always being provided by an adult. So I think the benefit is there in terms of agency and ownership for the children. And one of the most important things is it makes counting enjoyable. There's a real enjoyment of counting. The children can go back to these collections time and time again, so the collections need to be available to them all the time in the continuous provision in the setting, and the children could go individually or in pairs to go and count them whenever they would like to, outside of a more structured counting activity that maybe the adult might be guiding with them. So the children enjoy it. They enjoy going to count their favourite collections. They enjoy seeing if the collection has changed the number in there, maybe if you've changed them so that there are different numbers than the day before. They like revisiting the same things over and over again, and they like the success of feeling that they have counted them successfully. So they have that enthusiasm, and the adults and the children can enjoy counting together. And that's really important for the development of counting. So on this slide here, I've got some references for some of the things that I've referred to today. And there's some more there as well. So it just leaves it now for me to say thank you very much for watching this video. Thank you for sticking with it. If you do want to contact me about anything to do with early counting, I would love to hear from you. And thank you to Lumen for giving me this opportunity to talk to you through this video. Thank you.